Thank you everyone for joining us this evening for a conversation with the First Minister and Jewish students. I am the student representative on Skojek's council. I was previously 3 times president of Glasgow Jewish Society, have served on the Glasgow Jewish Representative Council, and have also studied both at undergraduate and postgraduate level at Glasgow University. Currently a student of law, and look forward to speaking to the First Minister tonight. For those of you who don't know, Skojek is the representative body of all the Jewish communities in Scotland, and we're delighted to be joined by Jewish students from over a dozen Scottish educational institutions across the country. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the First Minister this evening, and thank you for taking the time to come along and speak with us. And for those of you who are interested, it's worth noting that we hope to be joined by the First Minister for a hopefully in-person event later on in March, so stay tuned. So in terms of our community, the Jewish community, there are issues facing us now, in the past, different issues, the same issues. It varies. Now, this week, we've obviously seen the hostage taking in Texas, which we all watched, I think, with great horror. And thankfully, it was resolved as it was resolved with, all that being equal, we saw the Associated Press latterly writing a tweet suggesting that the incident was not anti-Semitic in nature, highlighting some of the issues that we face as a community. More locally speaking, less than a fortnight into 2022, the Jewish Chronicle published a story about a Glasgow University academic who smeared a Jewish student as being part of the lobby and claimed that Jewish MPs were working at the behest of foreign powers. These issues are real, they're on our doorstep, and so we thank the First Minister for coming here tonight and engaging with us about these issues. Before we get into questions, we'd just like to give Jewish students an opportunity to share their points of view individually, just to share some individual perspectives before we go into more general questions. And to start us off, Toby Vinical, a third-year accounting and finance student at the University of Strathclyde.
Before I start, I just want to thank you, First Minister, for giving us your time, and also to Kirsty and Jonathan and everyone at Skojek for organising this evening. I would love this evening to be an hour of sharing positive stories about how wonderful it is to be a Jewish student in Scotland, but sadly I don't think that'll be the case at all. Throughout my school experience, I was very cautious about exposing my Jewish identity and hid it the best as I could, having thrown coins thrown at my feet and being asked to play Shylock when we did The Merchant of Venice. I was anxious about putting Jewish in my UCAS application and anxious about telling people I was going to study accounting and finance, and the response would be, of course you are. Going into university, I felt I had to completely free myself of my Jewishness in order to fit into the status quo of university students, being anti-Israel and believing Jews are a powerful race who run banks and media. It is only in the last 2 years or so where I've truly embraced my identity, being fully open about it in university and in social media, by becoming an activist against anti-Semitism and for Jewish rights all around the world. What happened? I was told I wasn't wanted in certain groups and told that I was a white supremacist and a racist for simply standing up against anti-Semitism. In universities all over Scotland, progressiveness, diversity and inclusion appear to be paramount. But the unfortunate truth is, like David Baddiel's book, it is as if Jews don't count. Universities are meant to be places where people exchange ideas, embrace new cultures and learn from one another. But again here, Jews don't count. The Strathclyde Student Union have adopted anti-Semitic BDS policies, applying double standards to not only the sole Jewish state, but Jews living in the diaspora, by stopping any sort of productive dialogue silencing Jewish voices. Also, not adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is another common theme among Scottish universities, which begs the question, why? For Black and ethnic minority societies and universities across Scotland, Jews in the most part aren't considered an important part, as they're viewed as white and privileged, neither of which are true. It is upsetting to say that anti-Semitism is being normalised on our campuses, and I'm sick and tired of us all having to pretend to be something we're not, just to be accepted. It is the world's oldest hatred, and it is manifesting in so many forms in our educational spaces, allowing the virus of anti-Semitism to not only stay alive, but grow and grow until the words Jewish students in Scotland will become history. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. I must say that I echo many of those experiences. Next, we have Abel Kessler joining us. He's a third-year psychology student at the University of Glasgow. So thank you, Abel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I have been at the University of Glasgow for almost 3 years now. Before deciding where to attend university, I did my research. My main points included quality education, hands-on teaching, and first and foremost, an accepting and open-minded community. My first impression of the environment was extremely positive. Everyone seemed welcoming and friendly. Till the first time I publicly talked about my Judaism and relation to Israel in a class setting. After which some people turned away from me, and one even called Israel and everyone who would live there, including me, evil. There have been instances when a friend was physically abused, when they were dismissed in class just for being Jewish, when our Jewish society was completely ignored and dismissed by the council that is there to protect students. My direct or indirect experiences with anti-Semitism have only been piling up, to the point where today, me and my Jewish friends wake up each and every day with a thought in our heads that something will happen that day. Whether that be verbal abuse from a student, from someone on the street, or even a professor. And even though we receive great support from our elders and our amazing chaplains, we often feel alone. We have made several complaints who have tried to reason with fellow students and members of the faculty, often to no avail. We feel as if we are swimming against the tide, and it is exhausting and disheartening. There is no single measure solution to the threats we face today. However, I full-heartedly believe that through education, substantial change can be achieved. And by educating the upcoming generations about the Holocaust, they can learn about the realities of contemporary anti-Semitism and learn from the mistakes of the past for a better future. This, of course, will not solve all our problems. It will not change the present beliefs of a person, but it will educate some about the Jewish community and perhaps help future Jewish students to feel safety and a sense of belonging on university campuses. Holocaust education will allow Jewish people in Scotland to feel more acknowledged, supported, and most of all, to feel somewhat safer in our everyday lives. Thank you for allowing me to share my feelings and experiences.
Thank you very much, Abel. I must say it's particularly painful to hear that from a student at Glasgow University, having been Jewish study president there and devoted more than I would have liked of my time at the time to dealing with issues of anti-Semitism. A common anecdote went that if you mentioned Jewish issues or Israel in any of your academic work, you were guaranteed to be marked down. Before we move on to questions, First Minister, I would like to maybe give you an opportunity to engage with what has just been said by the two students sharing their experiences.
Thank you, Jonathan. And firstly, thank you for giving me the opportunity to engage with you this evening. I really do value this opportunity to hear from you, much more than to talk to you, although I look forward to do my best to answer your questions. I'm sure there'll be things I want to take away and reflect on, and areas that are raised tonight for further discussion. Just before I reflect on what I've just heard, though, let me also reiterate my commitment to an in-person event, hopefully sooner rather than later, now that we are coming out of this latest phase of COVID restrictions. We had hoped to have done that by now, but it is a commitment that I am absolutely determined to fulfil as soon as it's possible, and that will enable me to engage with a much bigger group of people from our Jewish communities. Look, I really do appreciate the frankness, and I'm under no illusion as to how deeply painful it is to articulate experiences like those we've just heard. I'm equally under no illusion that those experiences are all too representative of the life of Jewish students here in Scotland. It upsets me beyond words to hear any member of our Jewish community say that you feel you cannot be open, and not just open about, but celebrate your Jewish identity and Judaism. That is not acceptable. It upsets me beyond words, and we wouldn't accept this in any other group in society, to hear Jewish people, Jewish students, or anybody else from our Jewish communities say that they do not feel safe here in Scotland. That is not acceptable. I'm not going to pretend that over the course of our time together this evening I can reassure you on all of these issues, but the one thing I do want to assure you of is my absolute commitment to work with you tirelessly for as long as it takes for me to learn along the way to make sure that Scotland is a place where Jewish people feel safe, celebrated and valued. I value highly the contribution our Jewish communities make to Scotland. Scotland wouldn't be Scotland without that contribution. We wouldn't be the country we are. And it's really important that we are a country where that contribution can be acknowledged and welcomed and celebrated. So I want to assure you of that commitment. I think we've got lots to do and to address around that. The experiences I have just heard, if they were experiences being recounted by a Muslim student or by a student who was experiencing homophobia or racism of any other form, we would not hesitate to say that that was appalling and horrifying and was not acceptable, and we should have the same lack of hesitation in saying that in the face of what we've just heard. I don't deny and I do not challenge the work that we've got to do to challenge this and to ensure that Scotland is somewhere that has zero tolerance of anti-Semitism. I think that is vitally important, and I look forward to hearing some further views on exactly what more we need to do this evening. I agree that education is absolutely core to this, depressing though it is that we are still talking about the need to educate people about anti-Semitism and about the horrors of the Holocaust. The Scottish Government, as you know, has for many years now contributed funding to the Holocaust Education Trust, something that I feel very strongly about as being important. What I'm about to say is easy to say, it's much harder to achieve. I want Scotland to be a country where everybody feels able to be themselves, to celebrate their identity, to feel safe and secure, no matter who they are, where they come from, what that identity is. I don't think we're there yet. Arguably, there is no country in the world that is there yet, but I want to commit to working with you to making sure that that is a reality, not just for Jewish students, but for Jewish people living in Scotland, visiting Scotland here for however long. Obviously, what happened in Texas at the weekend, you don't have to be Jewish to be utterly horrified and appalled by that, but I understand the degree to which events like that will intensify that feeling of fear, and we need to recognise that. And I know that Police Scotland is very keen to continue to work with the Jewish community to try to allay those concerns. My final point before stopping, because I think it's much more important that I address your questions this evening, is around Israel. It is obviously, in any conversation I ever have with Skojek, with the Jewish community, this is readily acknowledged. It has to be the case that there is space to criticise the policies and the approaches of Israeli governments. I don't think anybody denies that, but that must never be allowed to become prejudice against or anti-Semitism towards people living in Israel or Jewish people living in Scotland or anywhere else. And that is a principle that we must all stand for. I'm going to stop there. There is no doubt lots more I could say, but I think it's probably better, not least for you, if I tailor my additional comments and contributions this evening in response to specific questions. So I'll stop there, Jonathan, and again, with thanks to you and Skojek for organising this, hand back to you.
Thank you, First Minister, and thank you very much for taking the time again to engage with us and to have a dialogue with us. I welcome your comments, of course, and your commitment to ensuring that Scotland becomes a place where Jewish people, like all other people, feel able to live freely and to celebrate and both freely display their identity. And I'm glad that you acknowledge that it's an ongoing work in progress. I think you're quite right. No society is perfect. That isn't perfect anywhere. But in terms of our questions, I think it's quite fitting we're talking about an ongoing work that perhaps we start with your own party. Forgive me for going straight in for the big guns, but there have been a number of incidents of anti-Semitism in the SNP, including former MSPs and MPs. As you just said, tackling anti-Semitism is an ongoing process. Now, I remember, and perhaps you do too, a few years ago, I had to force myself to start a petition against my then MSP, local to Glasgow University, Sandra White. Perhaps you remember. She had tweeted or retweeted, shared content that was classic anti-Semitism. And the apology that was made latterly was, in my humble opinion, disingenuous. I think many people in the Jewish community agreed with that at the time. And if we think back to the recent Labour anti-Semitism crisis, applying those standards to your own party, do you not think that perhaps the SNP has come up short, and that in the future, how would you be committed to tackling all forms of hate, including anti-Semitism in the SNP and the Scottish Government?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for going straight to that, because I don't think these discussions have meaning unless I am prepared to acknowledge these hard questions. Do I think we've come up short? I think inevitably and undoubtedly on occasions we will have done. I doubt there is a political party or an organisation that won't have at times, and we're talking about the SNP here, so I'll limit my comments to my own party. I don't pretend we are beyond reproach on these issues, but what I do believe and I'm committed to is addressing where we do fall short, learning from that, and ensuring that we apply those lessons so that hopefully we don't fall short in future. In terms of the incident with Sandra White, which I do remember well because I spoke to Sandra White about it at the time. She did apologise. I appreciate and respect your view and your description of that is disingenuous. I spoke to her directly. I believed at the time that apology was sincere. But I also recognise why you may have scepticism about that. One of the difficult issues, I think, and I do think, where you make your judgment on this particular issue will vary case by case based on an assessment of whether somebody has done something genuinely in ignorance of what they were doing or otherwise. But this tension and balance between having rightly a zero tolerance towards anti-Semitism, but also encouraging learning and education is always going to be a difficult one to strike. And as I say, I think that will vary in different cases. So I accept the responsibility to make sure that we always learn and seek not to fall short on these issues. On that specifically, and I think if memory serves me correctly on the sequencing here, since the issue with Sandra White, not solely because of that, but because of a general concern that we were not responding as well as we should, we have adopted as a party the IRA definition, and that is applied to our judgment. We, without going into detail, because it wouldn't be appropriate, and for all sorts of reasons, we will not infrequently reach out to SCOGEC for some informal advice about issues or things that have been said by members of the SNP to allow us, hopefully, to come to better judgments about the response that we take. So, look, I can only give you my personal commitment to tackling these issues. I can, and I am not going to insult your intelligence by saying we will never, ever, ever get it wrong. I will get it wrong sometimes on these issues. And therefore that commitment to learn and to apply the lessons that we learn is, I think, also an important one.
Thank you. And I think we all appreciate the sober realism you expressed there. Turning perhaps to other parties, as the majority party in the Scottish Parliament and a party that has certainly indicated its intent a number of times to cooperate with the Scottish Greens, what are your feelings on the question of the Scottish Green Party having not signed up to IRA as the SNP has done, definition of anti-Semitism, and given that two Green MSPs sit in your government as ministers, there is a concern among Jewish people that there is perhaps a blind spot towards issues of anti-Semitism relating to the Green Party on account of wider electoral issues, which electorally is understandable given the size of the Jewish community in Scotland, and yet, you know, there is a saying about judging a nation by how it treats its minorities.
Absolutely. And can I say I 100% agree with that saying? I think that is absolutely how, or one of the key ways in which any nation should be judged, and any party or organisation should be judged, how you treat the smallest minorities, who by definition of their size, not all, you know, will have the often not the loudest voice in these issues. So I agree with that. On the Green Party, the SNP and the Green Party are different parties. I don't make decisions for the Green Party. Look, my party has signed the IRA definition. My government, I'll come back to this point in a second, has signed up to the IRA definition. I would encourage all parties and organisations and institutions to do so, but I can't make those decisions for other organisations and institutions. What I am responsible for, well, two things. I'm responsible for what my own party does as leader of my party, and I've covered our position on that. And as First Minister, I'm responsible for my government's decisions. My government has signed up to that definition, and this is a key point in relation to the members of my government that are of the Green Party. The IRA definition applies to all ministers in my government. There is not an exemption for the Green ministers. All ministers in my government, without exception, are expected to comply with that. So I need to be judged on those organisations and institutions that I have responsibility for. I will continue to encourage others to follow that example, but I am not responsible and can obviously be responsible for the decisions they themselves take.
Thank you, First Minister. Our next question relates to a point was raised earlier by Jewish students as well as yourselves. It relates to Holocaust education. So a student said that they were aware Holocaust education was not in the Scottish education curriculum. Now, I don't know whether that is or isn't true personally, I have to say up front, but could you tell us perhaps a bit more about what the Scottish Government is doing to promote Holocaust education across the country?
Thanks. Without going into the technicalities here, I know the Education Secretary has recently proposed a roundtable specifically about education issues, and this is something perhaps that you might want to go into in more detail with her. But without going into all the technical details, Scotland doesn't have a statutory curriculum that is very prescriptive about what is taught and what is not taught. The curriculum for excellence is designed to be flexible, and it has at its core the education of young people as responsible and informed citizens. So we would expect things like Holocaust education to be part and parcel of that wider education approach. But one of the things I'm happy to take away is whether Holocaust education is sufficiently represented in the approaches that our schools are taking. As I said earlier on, I think in my opening remarks, we have for some time contributed funding to the Holocaust Education Trust. I think the work it does is exemplary and really important. I got the opportunity a few years ago to take part in one of the trips to Auschwitz, and one of the most profound experiences of my life, and we will continue to support that. But that in itself is not enough. We need to make sure that we are extending the reach of Holocaust education as widely as necessary. So I'm happy to take that point away, and as I say, the Education Secretary, I'm sure would be happy to discuss that in more detail with you.
Thank you. So our next question, and I'm sorry to come back to this topic, but it is a recurring theme, is anti-Semitism again on university campuses. The Community Security Trust, the CST, documented in the 2020 report relating to campus anti-Semitism that while Jewish students enjoy life and further education, they are still affected by anti-Semitism. I think both Toby and Abel spoke to that quite clearly. Now, student David from the University of St Andrews asks what specific initiatives the Scottish Government intends to take to combat anti-Semitism on campus. And a further question from another student asks, how the Scottish Government intends to support Jewish students specifically on campus in the future.
What I'm about to start and say, don't take us in any way trying to pass the buck of this question. It's not. It's just a statement of fact. Universities are independent institutions. And I say that actually so that we don't lose sight of the very serious responsibility that universities and their governing bodies have to ensure that campuses are not places where anti-Semitism can go unchallenged or flourish in any way. Not just this evening, I've heard over past times a multitude of experiences from Jewish students that would suggest, like society more generally, universities have work to do in that regard, and we will continue to challenge and support universities to make sure that we do that. Universities of all places should be settings in which it is possible to debate politics and policies, whether that's of the Israeli government or more generally, without going into that becoming in any way anti-Semitic in this context. I think there are also issues around security on campuses that we need to address, and we need to ensure that Police Scotland is addressing. So in a sense, universities, I'm talking to students here, there are a number I know of particular issues around universities, but universities are part of broader society. They don't sit apart from broader society, and that zero tolerance of anti-Semitism, of racism in any form, has to be as enforced and as strongly held on our university campuses as it is in any other part of society.
I think the next question will lead us on quite well then. I think we all agree that, of course, universities are a part of what is civic society, but the question is related specifically to the student, and so perhaps fittingly, the next question is one of a suggestion, and if I understand relates especially to Toby's point about Strathclyde, but also other universities, and that is, what will the Scottish Government do to encourage universities to adopt IRA? I'm aware Glasgow University has adopted IRA, a number of other universities have also, but there is still a great majority of universities in Scotland that haven't yet to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm.
Look, I suppose my earlier answer applies here. I would encourage universities to do so. I would encourage all organisations and institutions to do so. I'm not going to sit here, though, and tell you that we are in the position to enforce that. Universities are independent institutions, and they must be held accountable for their own decisions. But given that I lead a party and lead a government that have signed that definition, it follows that I think it's a good and important thing to do, and therefore I would strongly encourage universities to do likewise. I know some have. I think you said there Glasgow University has, which I'm glad. I'm a graduate of Glasgow University myself, so I'm pleased to hear that, and I would encourage others to do so, and if they are not doing so, to be open and transparent with their student body about the reasons for that.
Thank you. The next question relates to awareness and understanding of Jewish people in terms of faith and culture. So Hannah from the University of Edinburgh is originally from the US and asks or observes that when she moved to Scotland, few here seem to know much about Jewish culture, Jewish history. Now, I have to say, sort of, on a personal anecdotal note, I remember very clearly meeting a student for the first time in Scotland who'd said to me, "Hi, I've never seen a Jew before, may I shake your hand?" So as strange as it may sound, it is something that I think is less common in Scottish mainstream culture than it is, say, in the United States. And what do you think can the Scottish Government do to integrate education about Jewish culture into the Scottish education system? And perhaps more broadly, what do you think can be done to introduce a better understanding of Jewish culture through things like the media in Scotland?
So I think that question is very well placed and an accurate reflection, I guess, of the situation in Scotland. And while I don't think the size of any community in any country should be what influences the rights and the respect it has, I think undoubtedly the fact that, relatively speaking, Scotland's Jewish community is quite small probably means that there isn't that broad-based mainstream understanding of Jewish culture that we would like there to be. I think, going back to the earlier question about Holocaust education in schools and wider education, I think we need to reflect on whether the many cultures that make up Scottish society, including the Jewish culture, that young people have the opportunity, the sufficient opportunity to learn about the diversity of our country and the specific characteristics of different cultures. We, used to have a strapline. I think we probably still use it in some respects. One Scotland, many cultures. That's easy to say in a strapline. For that to have meaning, we really have to have a deeper understanding of the different cultures that make up our country. I think in recent times there have been some really helpful developments around this, which I'm not suggesting go far enough, but the Scottish Jewish Heritage Centre at Garnet Hill, for example, I know welcomes school visits from primary and secondary schools across the country. I think things like that are helpful and should be encouraged, and perhaps there's more the Scottish Government can and should do to support that. The Vision Schools programme is something that we fund, which supports teachers in teaching about the Holocaust and addressing anti-Semitism, and to help young people develop their knowledge around citizenship. So there's a number of things that we are doing. I think there is more that we can and need to do, and a bit like the question earlier on around Holocaust education in particular, I'm keen that this is something that you get the opportunity to go into more detail with and perhaps think about some of the steps we can take with the Education Secretary directly.
Thank you, First Minister. Our next question.
Sorry, Jonathan, sorry, I forgot about the media part of your question, which I wish politicians probably shouldn't talk about controlling or influencing the media. And I, as you can probably see in newspapers most days, I have limited ability to do that. But it is an important question because how the media represents life and society in Scotland has a big impact on how people then see that. And I would encourage, I think, this kind of session here this evening, it's not for me to suggest what you do and don't do, but I think, Jewish students, like you're doing with me right now, offering a session like this to newspaper editors, for example, might be quite powerful. And again, just ensuring that there is an understanding of the lived experience of Jewish students here in Scotland and the Jewish community more generally.
Thank you. So, a slightly lighter topic, hopefully, for the next question, Brexit. Now, you made no secret of your personal opposition to the project. We are where we are. So, in more pragmatic terms, perhaps, how do you intend, or how does the Scottish Government intend to ensure continued diversity on Scottish campuses that was previously, at least in part, ensured by the large number of European students that would come to Scotland?
So I'm sort of slightly smiling there at Brexit being called a lighter topic, but I suppose in this context it certainly is. I'm not going to go into all of the reasons why I thought and think Brexit is a thoroughly bad idea. I think we're starting to see the evidence of that emerge the more time passes. But one of the most regrettable aspects of this, in my view, is the forced withdrawal from the Erasmus programme and wider the ending of free movement within Europe, which I'm afraid inescapably will have an impact on the diversity of our universities. We hope to be able to, I won't go into my longer term hopes, or hopefully not too long term hopes, about Scotland being part of the EU again in due course, but shorter term we would hope to have the ability again to participate in Erasmus. But in the meantime, we're creating a Scottish education exchange programme to try to replicate to some extent what we had with Erasmus, and I will, and my government will, do everything we possibly can to showcase Scotland as a place that is good for people to come and study, live and work, recognising that for some people, and recognising that for the Jewish community sometimes that is not always reflected in reality. Diversity is one of our greatest strengths, but there's actually a less altruistic reason. We need to grow our population over the years to come, because our natural demographics are not positive. So we need to attract people to come here so that we've got those to do the jobs and service the economy that we need. So that's a really big commitment. I feel it very personally, but it is also really important for our hard-edged interests as a country.
Thank you, Minister. So sticking for a moment with the subject of diversity, there are a lot of interfaith initiatives on campuses across Scotland. The question reads, there is still a lot of work to be done, and the question asks, how do you think we can bring communities together for more meaningful cross-communal work?
So I believe passionately, not just in theory, but from my experience, in the power of interfaith work. And, you know, there may be different views around this virtual table right now on this. My view is that it is an area where Scotland's got a lot to be proud of, thanks to the different faith organisations in the country. I think our faith organisations do a huge amount of work to try to foster understanding and joint working and, you know, common approaches to things. You know, it's only one perhaps small example, but it's just recent. So it's the reason I'm citing it, the statement from the Muslim community about, you know, what happened in Texas at the weekend. But, you know, there is much, much broader and deeper interfaith work. I've tried as First Minister to encourage the development of this and to, in a very small way, support it. I host and convene on an annual basis an interfaith summit, which brings the leaders of our faith communities together in that, you know, very top level way to try to foster further working. But I think the power of this is in local communities. So it's something we've got to work at. It doesn't happen by accident. I'm sure there will be periods where it ebbs as well as flows, but I do think it is an area where we do have reason to be optimistic, and I will do everything I can to support the further embedding of that interfaith culture.
Thank you. So our next question is perhaps slightly more contentious. It reads as follows. Israel is important to most Jewish students, though of course our political opinions vary. Do you understand the importance of Israel to Jewish people, and how do you respect? How does one respect that connection? What's encouraging, challenging debate on Israel-Palestine? And second question that ties in very well with this relates to specifically online hatred. So Michael from the University of Edinburgh is asking, what measures are you taking to decrease online hatred directed at Jews and/or Israel via social media?
So in the first question, yes, I do understand and appreciate the importance of Israel for Jewish people across the world and for Jewish people here in Scotland, whether our Jewish community, long-standing Jewish community, or those who are here studying. Obviously, I'm not Jewish, so, you know, in understanding and appreciating that, I don't suggest that I understand that in the very, you know, intense personal way that Jewish people do, but I do appreciate that, and I think that is hugely important after centuries of persecution. You know, for many Jewish people, Israel was and is the fulfillment of Jewish aspirations and, you know, hopes for a homeland and a safe haven. And I think there is a duty on all of us to both understand that and understand the roots of and the reasons for that. I also, you know, understand the centrality of Israel in Jewish faith and thought, and, you know, that's hugely important to make sure is central to all of our discussions on this. I also believe, though, that the interests of Israel and Jewish communities across the world is best served by a sustainable peace in Israel and between Israel and Palestine. I think it's also important, although recognising the very different roots and reasons, to understand and respect the desire, the very strong desire of the Palestinian people for a sustainable state. I believe in a sustainable two-state solution. So that sustainable peace is absolutely critical, I think, not just to recognising in theory how important Israel is to Jewish people across the world, but also ensuring that that is respected in reality. And I hope that gives some assurance on that point. In terms of online abuse and hate, that is a very wide-based problem in Scotland and across the world right now. And the online mechanisms are all too often used to very directly target abuse at already discriminated against and stigmatised groups and communities, and therefore it is undoubtedly a vehicle for abuse and hate and harassment towards the Jewish community. I don't think there are any easy answers to this. Internet regulation is one of these responsibilities that's reserved to Westminster. It doesn't lie here in Edinburgh, but we are seeking to work with Westminster over, for example, its online safety bill to try to look at how we better regulate the internet to better tackle some of this. But of course, it is, again, reflective of wider views and prejudices within society. So we've got to tackle them at source while making it harder for people to use online mechanisms to perpetrate that abuse against different communities.
Thank you, First Minister. So last question touches on something you just talked about, and that is issues devolved to issues that are and are not devolved to the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament rather. So foreign affairs, foreign policy is not a devolved matter, and yet I think it is fair to say that the Scottish Parliament has been building up its competencies in the question of foreign affairs and international relations over the years, seeking to be a more active player on the international stage. Perhaps most recently, COP26 made Glasgow center stage. But with that in mind, how do you see development of bilateral relations with Israel between Scotland and Israel? What initiatives are there? Are you aware of anything that might perhaps be envisaged were there to be a successful yes vote?
So, I mean, on the issue of competence over foreign affairs, we don't have competence over foreign affairs, but there is nothing in the Scotland Act that prohibits the Scottish Parliament having views or opinions on matters that are reserved to Westminster. And, I think any Scottish Parliament is going to have an active interest in foreign affairs and seek to advance views around foreign affairs and make its views and opinions known at times. But there's also, I think, a more practical aspect to this, that foreign affairs cannot and is not completely divorced from trade policy, or in this age of tackling the climate emergency, from environmental policy. And many of these issues are devolved competencies, so that inevitably takes us into this space in pursuit of our own responsibilities, and COP is a good example of that. The Scottish Government is responsible for meeting our own climate change targets. Being able to do that necessitates having a global framework that is facilitating wider action on climate change. So we were not just intensely interested in, but had an active vested interest in making sure COP had the best outcome possible. So I think you're always going to see a Scottish Parliament, devolved or independent, be active on the international stage. Around trade, it's about, we have a number of Scottish Government offices in countries across the world, and that's about presenting Scotland's identity and all that Scotland has to offer to support our economy and to facilitate trade and investment. I think it's important, within the the framework of being able to speak freely and disagree about approaches to things with different governments where that is necessary, as they will no doubt disagree with us on certain things, to foster good bilateral relationships. One of the things I always seek to do when visiting countries like China, for example, is make sure that we raise our voice on issues of human rights. So, in engagements with representatives of the Israeli government, undoubtedly we would be frank in our views around the Israel-Palestine issue, as we would expect the representatives of the Israeli government to raise issues of concern about Scottish government policy. As it happens, in one of the sessions, the reception that took place in Kelvin Grove at COP, I had a long discussion with the Israeli Prime Minister. I have to confess, given the circumstances at the time, that discussion, not exclusively, but mainly focused on Israel's COVID vaccination success. Israel's probably been the leading country in the world in terms of COVID vaccination, but we had a very lengthy discussion at that opportunity.
Thank you very much, First Minister, for answering these questions for us this evening, and we're very, very grateful for your time again. Just wanted to reiterate that. I'd like to pass over now to Nicola Livingston, the chair of the SCOJEC, to give a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just unmuted myself. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As chair of SCOJEC, I wish to thank everyone for attending, particularly to thank the First Minister for requesting this meeting with Jewish students from across Scotland, and then for spending her evening with us, answering all these well thought out and searching questions from students so fully and frankly. We greatly value the relationship between yourself and the Jewish community, and thank you for speaking so passionately about how much you value the contribution of Jewish people in Scotland. I've taken particular note of your innovative suggestion to hold a session with journalists. That's certainly something that, as we take a particular note of your suggestion to hold a session with journalists, that's something I hadn't thought about. I can advise that we're looking to plan media training specifically for students, but this would be something else that's definitely worth looking at. This is the second such meeting you've held with Jewish students. I think the last was about 2015, if I remember correctly. It's obviously been more difficult to do it in this format than when you were able to meet students in person at the Parliament. So I wish to thank SCOJEC events team for the work that they've done in coordinating and running the event, along with your own staff, and particularly to thank Jonathan for your excellent chairing of this event. And also, like the First Minister did in her introduction, to remind you that we're hoping to have we're planning to have, it will happen, even if it doesn't happen in March and COVID allowing, to host the First Minister in person at a similar meeting for the Jewish community, and look forward to seeing some of you there. Thank you again, First Minister, and look forward to future conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. And First Minister, if I may invite you to just give a few closing remarks.
Look, I just want to say thank you for being frank. Thank you for being direct. I think it's really important that I hear from you, your experiences, your views and your challenges. And I accept those challenges. I really value these kind of engagements and look forward to doing it again in the future, hopefully in person. And I will take away all of the comments that have been made, all of the questions that have been asked, and reflect further on all of them. I am absolutely sincere in what I say about wanting Scotland to be a place where every Jewish person feels safe, secure, and able to celebrate their Jewish identity. I accept we are not at that place yet, and had I been in any doubt about that, which I wasn't, that doubt would have been dispelled in the early part of our discussion this evening. But I am 100% committed to working with you to make that a reality, because nothing less than that is acceptable to me, and obviously nothing less than that is acceptable to you. So thank you for your frankness and directness, and I look forward to getting the opportunity, I hope, to see you all in person before too long.